A great number of the issues that I confronted in the 1970s, both as a journalist and as a political activist, had to do with censorship and press freedom and public information. Reporters in Britain were arrested for trying to investigate matters touching on national security. The Official Secrets Act had a clause that even made the collection of information an offense. In the United States, there was a Freedom of Information Act that at least made the presumption of innocence when it came to disclosure. In London, an editor could be served by the state with a D notice, preventing him or her from publishing a story that might embarrass the government. In the United States, the First Amendment to the Constitution, as had been reaffirmed in the case of the Pentagon Papers, forbade prior restraint of the press. As for Parliament, its efforts to circumscribe the executive were little short of pathetic. Anyone who had watched or read the Fulbright or Church Committee hearings in Washington could only moan with contempt when a Westminster Select Committee made a feeble attempt to find out how British policy in Cyprus, say, had amounted to something between a betrayal and a fiasco. In the late 1970s, I nearly went to jail for revealing on a television program that the government had pre-vetted a London jury in an Official Secrets Act trial and, not content with excluding in advance anyone it suspected of sympathy with the defense, had also planted a former member of the elite Special Air Services Regiment in the box. The judge in the case halted the trial and summoned me for contempt of court. I carried a toothbrush around in my top pocket for a day or so, but his worship, meanwhile, succumbed to a stroke, the principal effect of which was amnesia, and so the danger passed. In America, as I kept pointing out, it would have been those who had interfered with the jury, not those who had caught them in the act, who would be the ones in danger of imprisonment. One more episode may illustrate my gradual enlightenment on these points. In the 1970s, there was a considerable nuisance from fascist and neo-Nazi groups in Britain, which mounted disgusting attacks on immigrants from the Commonwealth and began the recirculation of moth-eaten, or rather vermin-infested, anti-Semitic and Holocaust-denying screeds. It was one of one's standard duties as a leftist to turn out on weekends and block the efforts of this rabble to stage a march or to put up a platform in the street market. Stones and fists would fly, posters would be ripped down. It was all part of a storied socialist tradition that went back to the street combat with the black shirts in the 1930s. The police often seemed to me partial to the fascists. You could be arrested for your own protection, if you even looked as if you were going to make a fight of it. The one day I read in an American newspaper that in the town of Skokie, Illinois, the American Nazi Party was going to hold a swastika flourishing parade. They had chosen this particular suburb of Chicago because it had an unusually large population of Jewish refugees from Germany. Nice work. A temporary ban on the march had, I read, been imposed. But the same injunction was being contested in court by the American Civil Liberties Union. That had to be some kind of mistake. Socialist Worker, which I still read though I no longer helped to edit or sell it, published a viperous paragraph saying that this exposed the empty sham of American liberalism. I went into the thing more closely out of curiosity and read an excellent defense of the ACLU by its director, Aria Neyer, himself a refugee from Nazism. The First Amendment to the Constitution, he said, enshrined the right of all citizens to free expression and to free assembly. If this protection was withdrawn from anybody, perhaps especially somebody repulsively unpopular, then it would be weakened or diluted in general. It took me a space of time to assimilate this simple Jeffersonian point, if only because I had been raised in a culture where the law governing free speech and free assembly was whatever the nearest policeman happened to say it was. Then there was the American Embassy, with its horrible defacement of the West Side Governor Square. It had served in the 60s as an aesthetic target as much as a political one. But after the eviction of Nixon from the White House, this same neo-brutalist London fortress began to mount a sort of charm offensive. Elliot Richardson, the dignified attorney general who had refused Nixon's peremptory order to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Sachs the cocksacker, as a friend of mine had written on a placard outside the White House at the time, as if borrowing from Bob Conquest's most painstaking work, became ambassador and took an early opportunity to come and have lunch at the New Statesman. I hadn't seen liberal republicanism up close before, and thought it did appear to a touch self-satisfied. I felt I had met less attractive kinds of politics. Then, after an interval, the State Department gazetted Dr. Kingman Brewster to become its envoy. As president of Yale during the fabled Black Panther trial in New Haven, he had attracted a huge obloquy for apparently saying that a black man might be unable to receive a fair trial. Actually, he had only asked if this might be the case, rather than stated that it really was so. But once a bogus story had been printed for the first time, it will be reprinted again and again by the lazy and or the malicious. Ambassador Brewster and his wife gave a number of striking evenings at Winfield House in Regent's Park, Barbara Hutton's gift to both London and Washington, where there were sought-after seminars on everything from affirmative action to El Salvador. The guest list was, I thought, consciously weighted to the left of center. In due time, Ambassador Brewster agreed to sponsor me for a green card. Once again, an inescapable American note seemed to be that of generosity and large-mindedness. I'd be coy if I failed to mention another thing, which was American women. How can one phrase this delicately? English womanhood was, of course, adorable, and the idea of an English rose had not yet acquired the sickliness of the Diana epoch, but it did have a slight tendency to leave the initiative to the male. My besetting weakness in this department has always been that I like to know that initiatives are already welcome, if you catch my drift. This was one of the many differences in style between myself and young Amis, who quite correctly reasoned that neither party could be entirely sure of this welcome until one of them, and he was perfectly willing to volunteer for any ice-breaking duty, had put matters to the proof. American girls, I came to find, were more forward. They would come right out with it and would give direct voice, sometimes in a tone of near command, to their desires. I don't think that I can even begin sufficiently to express my gratitude. It was one such fling that reunited me with the United States after almost 7 years' absence from it. She met me in London, but she lived in New York, and when I boarded Pan Am to catch up with her, let alone when I saw again in the Pan Am building from high up on Park Avenue, I had a non-Platonic hint of that Platonic ideal whereby two separated spheres have been happily conjoined once more. This conviction outlasted the affair. From then on, every time I flew back to England, I was mentally busy with the idea that I would soon return to New York, this time on a one-way ticket. Thus, when I began to publish a few more pieces in The Nation, and on one such visit went to call on Victor Novaski at the magazine's downtown offices, and heard him inquire if I ever felt like coming over permanently, I felt I had flung a proper grappling hook across the water. All the awful business of visas, immigration forms, work permits, so very much worse now than it was then, would yield a little if I had a patron or sponsor. So on 9th of October 1981, I bought that one-way ticket and barely looked behind me as I went to Heathrow and flew west to see again what had become my favorite sight, Manhattan in early evening, as viewed in anticipation from the tip of Long Island. I had perhaps one suitcase, one half offer of part-time work at the Nation office, a truly saintly offer from a long-term stay in the West Village from my old hitch-proof Oxford friend Goldie Wells and her husband Peter, and a few $1,000s in the bank. There is, of course, a much derided way for Englishmen to try and make it in America, and perhaps especially in New York and Los Angeles. They charm their way into publishing, say, or advertising, or the movies, by the mere attitude and plausibility that's represented by their famous accent. And then at weekends, they get together and have Marmite and Earl Grey and discuss cricket scores and have a good snigger at the gullibility and sappiness of their American hosts. Really and truly hosts, as in the relationship with the parasitic. Waugh had lampooned in his description of Hollywood cricket players in The Loved One, which I forgot to mention is subtitled An Anglo-American Tragedy. For these, the club was a symbol of their Englishry. They collected subscriptions for the Red Cross and talked at their ease, out of the hearing of their alien employers and protectors. Shortly after I arrived in New York, Tom Wolfe claimed to have diagnosed the same syndrome in the Bonfire of the Vanities. One had the sense of a very rich and suave secret legion that had insinuated itself into the cooperative apartment houses of Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue. From there to pounce at will upon the Yankees' fat fowl, to devour at leisure the last plump white meat on the bones of capitalism. They were comrades in arms in the service of Great Britain's wounded chauvinism. I was offended when this fiction first came out, to read third-hand speculation that I was myself the model for the venal English hack and social climber Peter Fallow. True, I had deliberately offended Wolfe, who knows how to take an underhanded revenge, but not by haunting the penthouses of of Park or Fifth. To the contrary, I had written disobligingly about his reactionary affectations in a small West Coast leftist magazine called Mother Jones. This was hardly a revisme on my part. I was down with my fellow American radicals, not conspiring with a bunch of aristos and expats. Yet there is something about the English voice that can still catch some Americans, even outwardly assured white suit-wearing Virginians on the raw, more democratic Americans were happier with the sound of it. I resolved neither to exploit this nor to over-assimilate. When the young ladies of AT&T would say, "Just keep talking, I love your accent," I would respond, "But my dear, I don't have an accent. It's you who has the accent, and a very nice one too." 5 times out of 10, I would then be told I sounded like Richard Burton, which I do not quite understand was kindly meant. Actual class struggles apart, one of the aesthetic ways you could prove that there was a class system in America was by cogitating on the word or acronym WASP. First minted by E. Digby Baltzell in his book The Protestant Establishment, the term stood for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Except that, as I never grew tired of pointing out, the W was something of redundancy, there being a definition no BASP or JASPs for anyone to be confused with or confused about. ASP, on the other hand, lacked some of the all-important tone. There being so relatively few Anglo-Saxon Catholics in the United States, the S was arguably surplus to requirements as well. But then the acronym AS would scarcely do either, and it would raise an additional difficulty if Anglo-Saxon descent was the qualifying thing, which surely it was. Then why were George Wallace and Jerry Falwell not WASPs? After all, they were not merely white and Anglo-Saxon and Protestant, but very emphatic about all 3 things. Whereas a man like William F. Buckley, say, despite being a white Irish Catholic, radiated the very sort of demeanor for which the word WASP had been coined to begin with. So for the matter of that, did the dapper gentleman from Richmond, Virginia, Tom Wolfe. Could it be, then, that WASP was really a term of class rather than ethnicity? QED, those other white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of the less polished kind, had long enjoyed a colloquial description of their own. It was the good old word redneck, and those it described were concentrated in what H.L. Mencken had unfeelingly called the hookworm and incest belt of Anglo-Saxondom. Thus to be English in America was, if one had enjoyed something like an Oxbridge education and spoken tones acceptable to the then BBC, to be in the upper middle class almost by definition. As Sir Ambrose Abercrombie explains, the system of stratification in America, later on in The Loved One, you never find an Englishman among the underdogs, except in England, of course. There's an interesting corollary to this, which is that the hyphenation question is, and always has been and will be, different for English immigrants. One can be Italian-American, a Greek-American, an Irish-American, and so forth. Jews, for some reason, prefer the words the other way around, as in American Jewish Congress or American Jewish Committee. And any of those groups can and does have a National Day parade on Fifth Avenue in New York. But there's no such thing as an English American, let alone a British American, and one can only boggle at the idea of what if we did exist, our National Day parade on Fifth Avenue might look like. One can, though, be an Englishman in America. There is a culture, even a literature, possibly a language, and certainly a diplomatic and military relationship that can accurately be termed Anglo-American. But something in the very landscape and mapping of America, with 7 eastern seaboard states named for English monarchs or aristocrats, and countless hamlets and cities replicated from counties and shires across the Atlantic, that makes hyphenation redundant. Hyphenation, if one may be blunt, is for latecomers. It's been very absorbing, the term I hoped is the apt one, to see the emergence of another non-hyphenated immigrant group. Those from the south of the Rio Grande are now seldom, if ever, known as Mexican American, say, let alone Salvadorian American. They are instead Hispanic or Latino, and they, too, were in many ways forerunners rather than latecomers.